What happens to an empire when even its name is forgotten? When the kings are dust, the cities are ash, and the gods are silent, how does anything remain? The Hittites once ruled the highlands of Anatolia with fire and law, speaking a language no one could read, worshipping gods whose names slipped through the cracks of time. They signed the first peace treaty known to history, mastered the secrets of iron, and stood as equals to pharaohs. And then they vanished. For centuries, no one knew they had even existed. Not a single statue, not a known monument, not a legend that carried their memory forward, and yet their ruins were always there, buried beneath wheat fields, worn by rain, waiting in the stone. Who were these people who ruled with such force and vanished with such silence? What force burned their capital? Why did they leave no clear trace of their fall? And how did their language, the oldest written Indo-European tongue ever discovered, remain lost for so long? This is a journey into what was nearly erased. A path through fire-blackened cities, treaties carved in clay, sanctuaries to 1,000 gods, and letters left half-written in the shadow of collapse. We will follow the rise, the rule, and the ruin of an empire that once stood at the center of the ancient world, and ask why it took us so long to remember them. Because the Hittites did not disappear. We simply stopped listening. The wind blew low across the central Anatolian plain, rustling the dry grasses like whispers beneath the soil. We had been walking for hours, tracing the gentle rise of the land where no road dared stretch, no landmarks, no trails, just the quiet rhythm of our boots against the dust of 1,000 forgotten villages. Then we found it, not a monument or a ruin, but a scatter of obsidian flakes and the corner of a sunken wall. The first clue. Older than kingdoms, older than gods. Before the Hittites carved their lion gates or laid their roads across the spine of Asia Minor, this land was already alive. Not with empires, but with clusters of people. Tribal, fragmented, and mysterious. Archaeologists have given them names based on pottery styles or linguistic guesswork. The Hatti, the Luwians, the Casca, but their true names are lost to time. What we do know comes in fragments, scraps of baked clay, bone tools buried beside forgotten hearths. Anatolia was never empty. It was a corridor, a highland bridge between continents, and a crucible of ideas long before writing reached its stones. Around 6,000 years before the Hittites, the Neolithic city of Çatalhöyük flourished in the south. No streets, no rulers, just labyrinthine homes packed tightly together, rooftops used like pathways, shrines hidden in homes with walls painted in ochre and black. The dead were buried beneath the floors, as if ancestors watched over the living. It was not an empire, it was something else. But that was the South. Where we stood, in the shadow of the ancient capital to be, the signs were subtler, flint tools beside the streams, domesticated grains pressed into soil layers, early copper smelting sites tucked near the hills. These were the seeds of civilization, scattered and slow-growing. The Hatti, thought to be the earliest known inhabitants of central Anatolia, left no grand structures behind, but their influence lingers in the names we still find centuries later, embedded in Hittite ritual texts and echoed in later mythology. There was no single moment when the pre-Hittite world ended and the empire began. It happened gradually, like mist burning off a valley floor at sunrise. Cultural layers stacked like sediment. Some cities rose and fell within a single generation. Others, like Yazılıkaya, persisted long enough to leave behind tombs filled with gold and mystery. The graves of a ruling class whose language is unknown. whose gods we can only guess. These early people traded far and wide. We found lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from the east, and obsidian from Cappadocia. They carved idols of mother goddesses and bulls. They built temples with megalithic stones aligned with the stars. And yet, without writing, they vanished quietly into the deeper pages of prehistory. Their gods, their songs, their fears, all lost beneath later layers of conquest. What strikes me most, standing on these ancient sites, is not the silence, it's the feeling that the land remembers, as if the wind itself carries stories too faint for modern ears. Every broken shard and buried wall is a breath from a people who once looked up at these same stars, wondering about the future we now call the past. So before there were kings, there were ancestors. Before empire, there was survival. Before the Hittites, there was a land already worn smooth by the hands of those who came before. The ashes before the flame. The forgotten world that gave rise to one of history's most enigmatic empires. And here, among the grasses and the stone, the journey begins. The first time I held one of their tablets, it felt wrong. Not in the way of curses or dark omens, but like hearing a familiar voice speak in the wrong tongue. The script was cuneiform, borrowed from Mesopotamia. But the language? It was something else entirely. Something older than the empire that once ruled this land. Something that didn't belong. That was the clue that led us deeper to the story of a people who arrived not with war drums, but with words. Somewhere between the 3rd and 2nd millennium before the Common Era, the Indo-Europeans crossed into Anatolia. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know where exactly they came from. The steppes of the north? The forests of the east? The theories stretch like forgotten roads across Eurasia. But what we do know, what the earth has whispered through language and trade, is that they came. And they stayed. Their arrival was not a conquest, not at first. There are no grand battles recorded, no mass graves or charred cities. Instead, we find evidence of coexistence. Blended settlements, layers of culture one atop the other like veins of ore in the bedrock. They did not erase the Hatti, they absorbed them, and in doing so, they began to transform. The language they brought with them was different, an ancient relative of the tongues that would one day become Greek, Latin, Sanskrit. But here in Anatolia, it took on its own shape, Hittite, the oldest attested Indo-European language we have. It appears in treaties, in prayers, in royal decrees, but always filtered through the script of older civilizations. Writing borrowed, words inherited. It was a culture built on the bones of others. We traced their trail through burial mounds and river valleys. Pottery designs began to shift. Rituals changed subtly. Cattle herding increased. Symbols of storm gods and sky deities began to appear alongside the earthbound idols of the Hatti. This was not the fall of a culture, it was the fermentation of something new, something neither entirely foreign nor wholly native. Over generations, the Indo-Europeans who settled here stopped being outsiders. They became the Hittites. But their roots remained tangled in the soil of two worlds. They revered the local gods, but their own sky father still loomed above. They spoke the language of the plateau, but their syntax echoed a past far beyond these mountains. What fascinates me most is how subtle their imprint was. You could miss it if you were not listening carefully. A borrowed word in a ritual chant. A change in the way livestock were buried, a shift in city planning that favored fortified heights. The clues are not loud, they are quiet, patient, like the people themselves. Their presence reshaped the trajectory of this land. Without them, there would be no Hittite empire, no storm god pantheon carved into mountain temples, no treaties signed with Egypt, no ironwork quietly perfected in the Anatolian dark. Their arrival was not a bang, it was a seed, planted in fertile chaos that would take centuries to bear fruit. Today, when we read the tablets of Hattusa, we hear the echoes of their voice, strange, familiar, distant but not lost. They remind us that history is rarely born from conquest alone. Sometimes it grows from blending, from patience, from the soft collision of cultures beneath open skies. And so the Indo-Europeans did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived as carriers of memory, of language, of ancient songs. They came with the wind, settled in the highlands, and vanished into the people who would one day rise, build, and fall. This was the quiet beginning, the breath before the storm. The climb was slow. The road coiled around the rocky hills like an old serpent, broken in places by centuries of frost and rain. Stones jutted out at odd angles as if the earth itself was resisting our passage. But at the summit, the wind shifted, colder, sharper. And there it stood, the gate. 2 lions carved from stone, worn by time but still watching. Guardians of a city that once ruled the heart of a continent. This was Hattusa, capital of the Hittite kingdom, a city built with defiance in its bones. Hattusa did not begin as a capital. It was once a modest settlement, a trading post surrounded by forests and stone quarries. But sometime in the 17th century before the Common Era, a ruler named Labarna came with fire in his eyes and ambition in his blood. He took the city, rebuilt its walls, and called himself King of the land of Hatti. And with that, a kingdom was forged, not by inheritance, but by conquest and will. The city grew like a living thing. Walls extended over 7 kilometers, snaking across hills and valleys, enclosing not just buildings but mountains themselves. Some of the stones used in those walls weigh more than 10 tons. They were not just defenses, they were declarations. This city would not fall easily, and its presence would be felt across the Bronze Age world. Inside the walls, we found the bones of an empire in its infancy, palaces with central courtyards, temples layered with incense and sacrifice, archives filled with clay tablets, each one a fragment of memory. These were not the crude remnants of a forgotten tribe. This was bureaucracy, planning, vision, a kingdom waking up to its own destiny. What strikes me most is the layout. The city was not built for comfort, it was built for command. The upper city, with its towering gates and sanctuaries, looms over the lower levels. It was a throne overlooking its own heartbeat. From there, decrees were sent across the mountains. Armies marched, ambassadors arrived bearing gifts and secrets. The pulse of the kingdom began here, echoing outward like ripples in a dark pond. The people who lived here were not just soldiers and scribes. They were builders, astronomers, priests. They carved their world from stone and sky. The king was more than a ruler. He was a high priest, a conduit between gods and men. Every building, every gate, every step was part of a ritual geography, a city not just of stone, but of meaning. In the southern part of the city, we uncovered the Great Temple. Its foundations are still intact. Wide courtyards, storage rooms once filled with grain and oil, and at the heart, 2 chambers, one for the storm god, one for the sun goddess. Their names were borrowed from older peoples, but here they were reborn as patrons of a rising empire. As Hattusa rose, so did its influence. Trade routes opened, treaties were written, rivals were crushed or absorbed. The kingdom spread its fingers across Anatolia, claiming lands not with brute force alone, but with diplomacy and patience. It was not yet an empire, but the seed had been planted. A center of power had emerged, anchored in stone, ritual, and fear. I remember standing atop the royal citadel at dusk, watching the light catch on the broken walls. The silence was heavy, not empty, but full of memory. Here, among these ruins, the Hittites began their ascent, not through divine right, not through sheer numbers, but through belief in their gods, in their kings, and in the city they built high above the valley floor. Hattusa was not just a city, it was a statement that order could rise from chaos, that a people could shape the land to match their will, that something lasting could be carved from the bones of the earth, and from here, the kingdom would rise, and history would begin to listen. It was a room not built for beauty, just stone walls, dry air, the faint smell of dust and old clay. But within those shelves, beneath the soot of collapsed ceilings, lay the mind of a kingdom. Hundreds of tablets, each etched with lines so small and precise they seemed almost whispered onto the clay. And among them we found the code, the laws of the Hittite Empire, pressed into silence for over 3,000 years. When people think of ancient law, they often remember Hammurabi, the Babylonian king whose rules were carved in towering stone. The Hittite laws were different, less about spectacle, more about structure. Written in Cuneiform, but in the Hittite tongue, they offered a glimpse not just into crime and punishment, but into the fabric of everyday life. They revealed a civilization that balanced cruelty with compassion, order with flexibility. The laws stretched across all aspects of life. They dictated how to resolve a stolen pig, how to compensate for a lost eye, how to divide inheritance between sons. They told farmers what to do if a neighbor's ox damaged their crops. They set penalties for adultery, for assault, for sorcery. But unlike other ancient codes, many Hittite punishments were not fatal. Where Babylon demanded death, the Hittites often demanded restitution, compensation, balance. And yet, the code was not gentle. Slavery was legal. Women could be property. Certain crimes, particularly against the royal family or the gods, brought execution without mercy. The law reflected the kingdom's soul. Practical, but absolute in its reverence for authority. The king's word was final. His judgment was divine. What surprised me most were the protections. There were laws against unjust punishment, against excessive fines. Some articles even protected foreigners and slaves from abuse. It was not modern justice, but it was a system, and it showed a civilization trying, in its own way, to build fairness from fear. One set of laws focused entirely on ritual purity. What to do if a temple servant touched something unclean. How to cleanse a household after illness. These were not merely religious commands. They were part of the social fabric. Purity was power. Cleanliness was security. To break these laws was not just to offend the gods, it was to threaten the harmony of the state. The king was not above the law, but he was its embodiment. He issued decrees, revised penalties, and was expected to rule with ma'at, the balance between chaos and order. Every trial, every verdict was a reflection of the cosmic order. Justice was not a right, It was a duty shared between the king, the priests, and the people. The more we translated, the more human it became. Arguments between neighbors, disputes over boundary stones, fines for knocking down a wall. This was not a distant world. These were the bones of real lives. People trying to survive, to protect what was theirs, to avoid ruin. And in those clay tablets, their voices still echoed. Law gave the Hittite Empire stability. It allowed them to govern a patchwork of peoples, Luwians, Hatti, Hurrians, all with their own customs and gods. The code unified them, not by erasing difference, but by offering a common framework, a shared language of rules. When I placed the tablet back on its shelf, I felt something strange. Not awe, but respect. This was not a kingdom ruled by chaos or impulse. It was a machine, imperfect but intentional, held together by blood, stone, and law. In those brittle tablets lay the scaffolding of a civilization. And in reading them, we do not just learn what the Hittites feared, we learn what they valued: responsibility, order, memory. Injustice may have walked their streets, but so did the idea, however fragile, that justice mattered, even in a world ruled by kings and gods. The mountain air was thin as we climbed, carrying only the sound of our footsteps and the hush of wind sweeping through the trees. We were far from the palaces of Hattusa, following an ancient road cut into limestone in memory. And then, beyond a stone ridge, we found them, gods carved in procession across a sacred rock face. They stood in silence, frozen in time, their faces solemn, their hands lifted. This was Yazılıkaya, the sacred sanctuary of the Hittites, a temple not of brick and timber, but of shadow, wind, and unyielding stone. The Hittites worshipped what they called the 1,000 gods. It was not an exact number, but a phrase born from necessity. Their empire was built on cultural layers: Hatti, Hurrian, Luwian, and with each conquest came new deities, new rituals, new names. But instead of erasing the old gods, the Hittites absorbed them, honored them, translated them into their own mythologies until the divine became a swirling, interwoven pantheon of stone and storm. At the center of this chaos stood the storm god of Hatti. He was the Sky Lord, the bringer of rain, the breaker of drought. He ruled the heavens with lightning in his hand and justice on his breath. His consort was the sun goddess of Arena, radiant and calm, the mother of light. Together, they formed the divine pair, not just celestial beings, but symbols of royal power, natural order, and fertility. Yazılıkaya was their domain. A sanctuary without a roof. Carved deep into the rock, its reliefs show lines of gods, marching side by side like a celestial court. There's one chamber where male deities parade in long robes and pointed hats, another where goddesses face them across an invisible divide. At the heart of the procession, the storm god meets the sun goddess, and creation stands still in stone. These were not idols meant for crowds. There are no grand altars here, no space for mass gatherings. This was a place for initiation, for ritual, for kings and priests to commune with forces too vast for words. Some believe Yazılıkaya marked the New Year festival. Others think it was a tomb for divine kings. What we do know is this: the gods here are not distant. They are near, watching. The Hittite myths, preserved on clay tablets, speak of cosmic struggles, of dragons slain by storm, of gods who vanish and return with the seasons. These were not simple stories. They were metaphors for the cycles of nature, the balance between life and death, the shifting of power. In them, we hear echoes of older traditions from Mesopotamia and even early Indo-European tales, but the Hittites made them their own. Rituals were central to life. Every plague, drought, or war was seen as divine punishment, and so the Hittites performed endless rites to appease their gods. Grain offerings, libations, animal sacrifice, even reenactments of myth, with priests playing the roles of gods in carefully choreographed drama. The king himself was a priest, the queen a high priestess. The empire was a temple stretched across mountains. What I felt most, standing before those ancient carvings, was the quiet weight of belief. These gods were not abstract. They lived in the weather, the rivers, the stones. They were as real to the Hittites as the wind that howled through the sanctuary. And they demanded not just faith, but memory. Every ritual was a reminder, every offering a promise. To understand the Hittites, you must understand their gods. They ruled in stone and storm, in silence and thunder. They gave shape to the invisible, meaning to the uncertain. And though their names have faded, their faces remain, etched in stone where the sky meets the earth. This was not just religion, it was identity, and it carved itself into the soul of an empire. The tablet was cold in my hands, not just from the stone, but from the weight of the words pressed into it. Ancient symbols, shaped in precise cuneiform, still sharp despite the centuries. It was a treaty, a peace forged not in ink but in clay, between two empires that had once met in fire and blood, Egypt and Hatti. Enemies once, bound by war, and then bound by something even rarer, trust. The Battle of Kadesh. That was the beginning. In the 13th century before the Common Era, the two great powers of the ancient world collided near the banks of the Orontes River. Ramses II of Egypt, with his chariots and banners raised high. Muwatalli II of Hatti, commanding a coalition of allies and warriors from across his dominion. For a day the world trembled under iron and hoof. Both sides claimed victory, but the truth, as always, lay somewhere in the dust between them. Neither empire could afford another war like it. The cost in men, resources, and prestige was too great. And so, decades later, Ramses sat on his throne in Pi-Ramesses. Hattusa III ruled from the mountain capital of Hattusa, and between them, silence. Until a message was sent, a proposal, a pact, a step toward peace unlike any the world had seen before. The result was the Treaty of Kadesh, carved into clay by the Hittites, inscribed in hieroglyphs by the Egyptians. 2 copies, 2 scripts. But the words, nearly identical. They pledged not just an end to hostilities, but a bond of brotherhood, mutual defense, extradition of fugitives, even a shared responsibility to uphold the order of the world. This was not a handshake across a table. It was a political act of theater and strategy. The Hittites faced threats on their northern borders. Egypt watched the growing power of Assyria with unease. Alone, each was vulnerable. Together, they formed a balance, not of friendship, but of necessity. And in that necessity, something remarkable was born. We found the Hittite version of the treaty in the archives of Hattusa, etched on clay tablets now housed in Istanbul. The Egyptian copy was carved into the walls of the Karnak temple in Thebes. Both bear the seals of their kings, both invoke their gods, and both speak of a world in which honor, even among rivals, could be real. What is most striking is the tone. The language is not of subjugation or superiority. It speaks of equals, great kings, sons of great gods, acting in the name of their peoples. They call each other brothers. They swear by the sun, the storm, the river, and in doing so, they shape a vision of diplomacy far ahead of its time. The treaty did more than halt war. It opened the door to alliance. Years later, Hattusa sent his daughter to Egypt to marry Ramses, a Hittite princess in a foreign court, binding the two lines in blood. It was a moment that blurred the boundaries between diplomacy and family, between empire and trust. Standing before the stone copy in Egypt, reading words that mirrored those we found in Anatolia, I felt a strange sense of awe. These two powers, separated by deserts and ambition, chose dialogue, chose language, chose to write their names not on swords but on stone. And by doing so, they shaped a legacy. Today, a replica of the treaty hangs in the United Nations headquarters, a reminder that even in the age of chariots and divine kings, peace was possible. Fragile, yes, temporary perhaps, but in the quiet corridors of Hattusa where the tablet was born, the message still lingers, that sometimes the most powerful act a king can make is to listen. And in that listening, reshape the world. We found the slag heap at the edge of a forgotten forest, where the hills slump into the river valleys like old bones. The site looked unremarkable, just darkened soil, broken stone, and the remains of fire long extinguished. But beneath the surface, the truth glimmered. Not gold, not silver, something rarer in its time, iron, worked and shaped centuries before most of the world had learned its secrets. And from this shadowed craft, the Hittites drew power, quiet, unseen, and enduring. In the late Bronze Age, metal meant dominance. Bronze was the backbone of empires. It armed soldiers, built tools, and funded kings. But bronze depended on tin, a metal that had to be imported across vast, dangerous trade routes. Tin came from distant lands, and with it came risk. But iron was different. It was buried close, hidden in the veins of local hills. And the Hittites learned how to find it, how to pull it from the earth, how to tame its strength with flame and force. Unlike bronze, iron did not announce itself with brilliance. It lacked the golden glow. It rusted. It resisted the easy touch of craftsmen. But in Hatti, something changed. Blacksmiths, perhaps priests in secret, learned to smelt and shape it. Not on a massive scale, not yet, but enough to matter. Enough to give their kingdom an edge, subtle and silent. There are no grand proclamations about this discovery. The Hittites did not trumpet their knowledge in stone or song. Instead, they kept it close, a state secret, a weapon not of armies, but of time. We find traces in the burial goods of elites, a dagger here, a pin there, objects of ceremonial value, yes, but also markers of transition. The world was changing, and the Hittites stood at the threshold. In the archives of Hattusa, we found texts that hinted at this guarded knowledge. References to the black metal and to sacred forges deep within temple complexes. It suggests that metallurgy was not just science, it was sacred. The fire, the hammer, the transformation of ore into blade, these were rituals, not just craft. And those who controlled the process controlled the future. Iron did not win battles overnight. Bronze still reigned in chariots and armor. But iron whispered of independence, of a time when empires would no longer rely on distant mines, when local strength could fuel global ambition. The Hittites were first, not alone, but first enough to matter. And then, as suddenly as it rose, the knowledge disappeared. When the empire fell, The craft of iron smelting in Anatolia seemed to vanish with it. It would resurface centuries later in new hands, reshaped and refined. But the origin, the spark, began here, in the quiet forges beneath the Anatolian sky. What haunts me most is the silence, the lack of boast, the deliberate hiding of power. The Hittites were not showmen, they were strategists. They understood that some strengths are best kept in shadow, that the future belongs not just to those who wield weapons, but to those who prepare them in the dark. Today, when we speak of the Iron Age, we often skip this chapter. We jump from bronze to steel as if the path was straight. But in truth, it passed through these hills, through these forges, through the hands of nameless Hittite smiths who cracked the code of iron while the world still clung to bronze. This was not just an empire of stone and storm, it was an empire of fire, of transformation, of secrets held close until the world was ready to follow. In their shadows, the Iron Age stirred, and history quietly began to turn. The air was thicker near the Euphrates, warmer, heavy with the scent of river silt and sun-baked earth. We approached the ruins of Carchemish at dawn, where broken columns cast long shadows over the cracked flagstones. There was a stillness in the stones, a kind of dignity even in ruin. This had once been a city of kings, a gate to the east, a prize taken in blood and strategy by the rising Hittite power. Here, the empire expanded not just in size, but in ambition. Carchemish was not just another city, it was a crossroads, a fortified jewel perched along the lifeblood of trade, where caravans moved between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. To control Carchemish was to hold a knife at the throat of commerce, and the Hittites knew it. So did the Mitanni, the kingdom that held it first. For years, these two powers danced around it, spying, threatening, skirmishing, until, at last, the Hittites struck. The conquest came under the reign of Suppiluliuma I, a ruler not remembered for modesty or hesitation. His campaigns were swift and layered with cunning. He did not march blindly into Carchemish. He dismantled its allies first. One by one, cities in the orbit of Mitanni fell, each a stepping stone toward the heart. And when the time came, Carchemish could not stand alone. We found remnants of the battle in the ruins, arrowheads clustered near collapsed gates, burn layers beneath later foundations. The scars of siege are always buried deep, but they remain. The Hittites took the city, but they did not destroy it. They did something far more powerful. They made it theirs. Instead of looting it bare, Suppiluliuma installed his own son as ruler, a viceroy in Hittite dress, bound by blood and allegiance. This was not just conquest, it was annexation by assimilation. Carchemish became a second capital, a southern mirror of Hattusa, reflecting the will of the king across distant borders. The decision was strategic. Carchemish sat at the edge of Hittite reach, closer to Egypt and the restless lands of Syria. By placing a royal son there, the Hittites established a forward presence, a watchtower over the shifting tides of alliance and rebellion. From here, they could intercept messages, mobilize armies, and maintain a grip on the southern trade arteries. What impressed me most was how seamlessly the cultures intertwined. In later inscriptions, we see Hittite names alongside Hurrian ones, gods shared between temples, art that blended Anatolian rigidity with Mesopotamian elegance. Carchemish did not become Hattusa, it became something else, a fusion, a frontier of identity. Even after the fall of the main empire, Carchemish endured. While Hattusa burned, Carchemish continued under Neo-Hittite rulers. The dynasty lasted nearly 400 years beyond the collapse, a thread of continuity through the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. This city, born of conquest, became the last flame to carry the Hittite legacy into the Iron Age. Standing there, amid the silence, I imagine the son of Suppiluliuma staring north toward his father's city, holding the empire's edge with one hand and shaping its future with the other. The Euphrates still flowed beside the ruins, slower now, but steady, as if echoing the endurance of this ancient stronghold. Carchemish was more than a conquest, it was a statement that the Hittites were not content to rule from the highlands, that their empire reached rivers, deserts, and mines. Through this city, they spoke to the world beyond their mountains, and though empires fell, the echoes of that voice remain, carved in basalt, buried in sand, and waiting, always waiting, to be heard again. The archives were quiet that morning. Dust hung in the air like old breath, stirred only by the motion of a tablet being lifted from its cradle. The writing was rushed, uneven, not the neat hand of a scribe recording tribute or royal decree. These were letters of urgency, of fear, a queen writing to the gods, pleading, begging for relief, because death had come, and with it the certainty that even kings could bleed. It began, they say, after a war. The Hittites had returned victorious from campaigns in the south. Cities had fallen. Spoils were brought north. Among them, unknowingly, a traveler no army could defeat. The plague, a sickness without name, without cure, that swept through the empire like fire in dry grass. Soldiers died in their tents. Priests collapsed beside altars, and soon even the palace walls could not keep it out. King Suppiluliuma I, one of the greatest Hittite conquerors, was among the first to fall. He had expanded the empire's reach farther than any before him, broken the power of Mitanni, and established dominance from Anatolia to Syria. But all his victories could not save him. The records say he died suddenly, and with him, the balance of the kingdom began to tremble. What followed was uncertainty. His son, Arnuwanda II, took the throne, but he too was stricken. His reign was brief and quiet, a shadow of what had come before. The sickness lingered, clawing at the court, weakening the body of the state, and beneath it all, the people began to whisper. Had the gods turned away? Had the kingdom gone too far? In one tablet, Queen Puduhepa, wife of the later king Hattusili III, speaks of ritual, sacrifice, and divine silence. She describes sending emissaries to distant lands for remedies. She begs for omens. She performs purification rites. She does everything within her power to cleanse the kingdom. But the sickness endures, and with each passing season, the weight of uncertainty grows heavier. The Hittites believed disease was punishment, not just a natural event, but a breach in cosmic order, a broken vow, a forgotten god. Every epidemic demanded an answer, and when none came, fear took root. The empire, built on laws and ritual, found itself in a place its code could not reach. The effects were not just spiritual. Economically, the plague disrupted harvests and trade. Militarily, it weakened garrisons and slowed expansion. Politically, it deepened succession crises and fractured loyalties. Every region touched by the sickness became more fragile, more unpredictable. The kingdom did not collapse, not yet, but it wavered. Even now, we do not know what the disease was. Some speculate it was smallpox, others a severe strain of influenza. All we have are the words left behind, descriptions of suffering, reports of towns abandoned, temples silent, and letters, always more letters, from leaders who had run out of options. Standing in the dim archive chamber, I could feel it, not the sickness, but the desperation. These tablets were not carved to impress. They were carved because someone had to bear witness, because even empires need to be heard when they cry out in the dark. The plague that shook the throne did not destroy the Hittites, but it changed them. It humbled their court. It reminded their kings that power could not protect from fate, and in its wake, a different kind of rule emerged, more cautious, more dependent on diplomacy and divine favor. When we think of ancient power, we think of war, wealth, and walls, but sometimes the true test comes in silence, in waiting, in the helplessness that follows when strength fails. And it is in that silence, in those fragile letters scratched into clay, that the soul of the empire still whispers. The deeper we dug into the archives of Hattusa, the less it felt like we were reading history, and more like we were eavesdropping. Letters whispered of betrayals, treaties laced with hidden intent, royal edicts that concealed more than they revealed. The palace walls may have been stone, but the court within them was woven from something far more fragile: trust. The Hittite court was a world of careful balance. Kings ruled with divine authority, but they were surrounded by rivals, brothers, uncles, generals, priests, all with their own ambitions. Power was a shifting current. One misstep, one poorly chosen word, and the throne could become a grave. The most striking tale comes not from within Hattusa, but from a letter found far to the south in Egypt. Carved in the records of Pharaoh Tutankhamun's court, it tells of a queen, a Hittite queen, writing to Egypt in desperation. Her husband, the king, had died. She had no son. She feared civil war, and so she proposed something unthinkable: that an Egyptian prince come north to marry her and rule the Hittite throne. It sounds like fiction, a royal widow reaching across enemy lines for salvation. But the letter was real, and the response was swift. The Egyptians hesitated, suspicious of a trap. But eventually they sent a prince. He never arrived. Somewhere near the border, he was killed, ambushed, silenced. Whether by Egyptian agents or Hittite rivals, we do not know. But the message was clear: in the Hittite court, power had its price. Back in Hattusa, succession was rarely smooth. Kings were chosen, yes, but they also had to survive. Brothers were the most dangerous, often educated, experienced, and with armies of their own. Some kings elevated their siblings to high offices in hopes of peace. Others had them exiled or executed. Blood was a double-edged sword. Even within the royal household, politics thrived. Queens like Puruhepa were not silent figures. She corresponded with foreign rulers, oversaw temples, and advised her husband Hattusili III on matters of state. Her letters reveal a mind sharp and unflinching. Her influence was not behind the scenes. It was direct, deliberate, and widely respected. Yet ambition was not limited to royalty. The priesthood held its own power. Temple treasuries rivaled the royal coffers. Oracles were consulted before every major decision, and the chief priests could shape policy simply by declaring divine disapproval. The gods spoke often, and not always in favor of the king. Spies moved through the court in silence. Letters were intercepted. Alliances formed behind closed doors. We found lists of informants, sealed orders for arrests, and reports written in veiled language. Trust was currency. Loyalty, a performance. And betrayal, always near. What fascinates me is how much of this intrigue was recorded, not hidden, not burned, but preserved. Perhaps as a warning, perhaps as a mirror. The tablets do not just chronicle events, they capture mood, tension, the breath before the blade. In one letter, a king scolds his vassal for plotting with a rival court. The tone is almost casual, a reminder of who is watching. In another, a scribe notes that a general tarries too long in the south, a line that could mean logistics or sedition. The court was fluent in ambiguity. And yet, despite the danger, the system endured. The empire did not collapse from within, not yet. The intrigues, the betrayals, the secrets, they were not cracks in the wall. They were the mortar, the means by which balance was kept in an age of uncertainty. The royal court was not just the seat of power, it was the theater of survival. And within its rooms, beneath its polished stone, the Hittite Empire played its most delicate game, a game where the stakes were thrones, and the pieces were people. The first thing I noticed was the blackened stone. Not soot, not surface burn, but deep fire scars baked into the walls of the upper city. They were not from cooking hearths or ritual flame. They were from destruction. Wide, sudden, final. This was not decay. This was collapse. The kind of fire that ends an era. And in Hattusa, it came without warning. For centuries, the Hittite capital had stood as a fortress in the hills. Its walls wrapped the ridges like a crown. Its gates opened to ambassadors, armies, and merchants. But sometime around the early 12th century before the Common Era, the city was abandoned. Not peacefully, not gradually, but in panic. Entire districts emptied, temples looted, archives scattered and burned. Then silence. What caused it? That question haunts every tablet, every shattered seal. The Sea Peoples are often blamed, a mysterious wave of raiders that stormed through the eastern Mediterranean, toppling cities and kingdoms. But they left no records of their own, only devastation in their wake. Did they reach the Central Plateau? Did they breach the lion gates of Hattusa? Maybe. Others point to famine, drought. Letters from the final years speak of food shortages, of grain shipments delayed, of fields lying fallow. A single bad harvest could break a region. Several could break an empire. And if the gods were silent, so too became the kingdom. Still others look inward. Succession disputes, fractured vassals, diminished faith in the royal line. The Hittite Empire was never a monolith. It was a careful weave of tribes, cities, and shifting loyalties. If one thread broke, the whole tapestry might unravel. When we walked the ruins, we saw the traces of departure. Storerooms emptied, not looted. Gates left open, not smashed. It was not a massacre, it was an exodus. As if the people knew the end was coming, as if they chose to walk away before the fire arrived. In the city's archive quarter, we found fragments of tablets charred at the edges. Legal texts, ritual instructions, letters that end mid-sentence. No final proclamation, no farewell, just interruption, like a breath taken in but never let out. What stands out most is what did not survive. The royal palaces, gone. The temples, ruined. The statues, toppled or shattered. The city that once orchestrated diplomacy with Egypt, that sent iron across trade routes, that spoke in the voices of 1,000 gods, was reduced to wind and rubble. But Hattusa's fall was not the end of the Hittite story. In places like Carchemish, in the Neo-Hittite states of Syria, the bloodline endured, the language shifted, the rituals adapted. The lion gates still guarded new cities. But the heart, the pulse of the old empire, had gone silent. For centuries, no one knew what had happened. Hittites were barely remembered, their name preserved only in foreign archives. Even their language was lost. A whole civilization, once a rival to Egypt, vanished from memory. Until the tablets were found, until the stones spoke again. The fall of Hattusa was not a single moment. It was a culmination of outside pressure, of internal weakness, of nature's wrath and human frailty. It was the fire before the silence, and the silence lasted for over 3,000 years. As I stood in the shadow of the ruins, the sun sinking low behind the broken city wall, I thought of what it meant, not just to lose a city, but to lose the idea of it. The dreams, the laws, the prayers, all drifting into dust. And yet, here they were again, unearthed, heard, remembered. Hattusa burned, but it did not disappear. Its ashes hold stories still unfolding, and from those ashes we listen, not to answers, but to echoes, echoes that refuse to be forgotten. We were following a narrow path between low hills, the sky thick with morning mist, when we came upon the village. Just a scatter of stone foundations swallowed by grass and time. No inscriptions, no monuments. But in the soil, fragments of pottery lay scattered like breadcrumbs. Familiar shapes, familiar patterns. And among them, a symbol, a sun disk, faint but clear. It was Hittite, not from the empire's golden age, but from after. From the people who remained when the throne was gone. After the fall of Hattusa, the empire vanished from sight. But the Hittites themselves did not disappear. They scattered, fractured, faded into the fabric of other lands. Some moved south to the fringes of Syria and the Levant. Others stayed hidden in the highlands of Anatolia. Farmers, traders, scribes, survivors. They no longer had an empire, but they still carried its memory. In the south, places like Carchemish and Melad became centers of continuity. Neo-Hittite kingdoms, as we call them today, rose from the ashes of the empire. They built on old foundations, spoke in tongues descended from the Hittite language, worshipped familiar gods beneath new names. These cities became the last embers of a forgotten fire, holding on to identity even as the world changed around them. But for those who stayed in the north, the story grew quieter. No royal courts, no grand temples, just echoes. We find their traces in village ruins, in reused building stones, in oral traditions passed down across generations. They lived, they worked, they remembered, but they left few words behind. The empire had taught them to write. The collapse taught them to be silent. Some became part of other cultures. They blended with Luwians, Phrygians, and later Greeks. Their gods were absorbed, their customs reshaped. Over time, even their name began to vanish. In Assyrian texts, they are still mentioned, the people of Hatti. But by then, their power was symbolic. Their past, already myth. Still, the DNA of the Hittite world endured. We see it in architecture, in ritual patterns, in political traditions passed down through successor states. Even in language, some words traveled far, carried by merchants and migrants, finding homes in distant tongues. Memory does not always need monuments. Sometimes it survives in the way a roof is built. or in how a field is sown. The most haunting discovery came not from a palace, but from a well. Deep in a rural site, archaeologists found a collection of discarded tools, broken, worn, but made in the old style, not by artisans of a flourishing empire, but by descendants keeping old habits alive. They were not kings, they were not priests, they were the forgotten people, living in the long shadow of a lost world. What does it mean to survive like that? Not to be remembered in stone or story, but to endure quietly, to carry your culture not as a banner, but as a burden. These people did not rise again. They did not reclaim their empire, but they endured. And in that endurance, they left something behind. Standing among the scattered stones of that village, I felt the weight of their absence. Not because they were gone, but because they had been unseen for so long. The Hittite Empire may have fallen in fire, but the people walked away from the blaze. They took what they could, their gods, their crafts, their memories, and they kept walking. We call them forgotten, but they remembered, in their own ways, in their quiet persistence, in their fragments beneath the earth. And now, as we uncover their traces, piece by piece, we remember them too. They were never just a footnote, they were the last heartbeat of a lost empire, the ones who lived when the story was supposed to be over, and perhaps, in their silence, they speak the loudest of all. The clay tablet was cracked, its surface dulled by centuries of silence. But the marks were still there, tiny, wedge-shaped impressions pressed into damp earth by hands long gone. To the untrained eye, it was a pattern without meaning. But for those who knew what to look for, it was a voice, waiting to speak again. Cuneiform, one of humanity's oldest scripts, and the key to unlocking the Hittites' forgotten world. For almost 3,000 years, the Hittite Empire had vanished without explanation. Ancient historians mentioned them only in passing. The Bible named them but offered no detail. To scholars in the 19th century, the Hittites were more myth than memory. A ghost civilization, lost between Egypt and Mesopotamia, with no ruins and no language, until they found the tablets. The rediscovery began with stone. In the highlands of central Turkey, explorers uncovered massive ruins near the modern village of Bogus Kale. Broken walls, lion gates, underground chambers. But what changed everything was what they found beneath the stones: tens of thousands of clay tablets scattered across the collapsed archives of Hattusa. The capital had been silent for centuries. Now it spoke. At first, no one understood the language. The script was cuneiform, yes, but the language behind it was unknown. Not Akkadian, not Sumerian. Something older, stranger. It would take decades to decode. A puzzle of phonetics and patience, the work of many hands across many nations. But slowly, syllable by syllable, the Hittites began to speak. The breakthrough came in the early 20th century. Scholars compared recurring symbols, matched names mentioned in Egyptian records, and found linguistic relatives in early Indo-European tongues. When they realized that the Hittite language shared roots with Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, it reshaped everything we thought we knew about the migrations of ancient peoples. This was not a Semitic language like those of Babylon or Assyria. It was something else, an echo from the steppe lands, a linguistic fossil preserved in clay. The Hittites were not just neighbors of the great civilizations, they were one of them, with a language, a history, and a voice all their own. Reading the tablets was like stepping into a forgotten library. We found treaties, legal codes, royal correspondence, hymns to gods and prayers for rain, medical texts, prophecies, even jokes. The Hittites were not shadows anymore. They had opinions, arguments, personalities, and through their words, they re-entered history. One of the most remarkable finds was a letter from the Hittite king to the Egyptian pharaoh, the very treaty that once ended the war at Kadesh. For centuries, Egypt's version had stood alone, carved in stone. But here was the other side, written in Cuneiform, echoing the same promise of peace, but in the voice of a different world. The decipherment of Hittite cuneiform did more than restore a language. It revived a civilization. It proved that history is not a fixed story, but a living map, with pieces still waiting to be found. And it reminded us that silence does not mean absence. The Hittites had always been there. We had simply forgotten how to listen. Today, their tablets are preserved in museums and archives. The language is studied in universities. Their myths are translated. Their laws debated. From forgotten stones, a civilization was raised again, not in buildings, but in understanding. I remember tracing one line of script with my finger, feeling the grooves pressed by a scribe nearly 30 centuries ago. He did not know we would read his words. He wrote for his gods, for his king, for his people. But now, we listen, we learn, we remember. The rediscovery of cuneiform gave the Hittites back their voice, and in doing so, it gave us back a piece of our shared human story. Not as a myth, not as a mystery, but as a truth carved in clay. We were walking through a wheat field when I saw it, a weathered lion's head, half buried, barely visible beneath the roots. No marker, no sign, just stone, shaped by ancient hands, resting where tractors now pass and children play. This was not a museum. This was not a dig site. This was modern Turkey. And beneath its fields and villages, the Hittites still sleep. The empire is gone, the cities burned, the kings forgotten. But the land remembers. In every ridge of stone that breaks the soil, in every name whispered in the hills, there are echoes of what once was. Some villagers still speak of underground chambers or strange carvings near their farms. Some find tools and ornaments while digging wells or planting trees. Most do not know the names, but they feel the weight, as if the past lies just beneath the skin of the present. In Boğazkale, where Hattusa once ruled, a modern town has risen. Modest homes, quiet streets. Children race bicycles along paths once walked by priests and generals. The ruins of the capital lie nearby, but life continues around them. The past is not a separate place here. It is a layer beneath the floorboards, a memory in the stone. Some farmers have learned to work around the ruins. They till the soil with care, avoiding areas where old walls rise like ribs from the earth. Others have donated land for excavations, unsure of the story but proud to be part of it. They do not claim to be descendants of the Hittites, but in their silence, their closeness to the land, something familiar lingers. The language is gone, the gods no longer prayed to, but the shapes remain, in architecture, in patterns of village layout, in the echoes of harvest festivals whose roots may stretch farther back than we know. The past, when buried well, does not vanish. It becomes soil, fertile, waiting. In museums across Turkey, artifacts recovered from the Hittite world are displayed with quiet reverence. Clay tablets, stone reliefs, jewelry, tools, and always the lion statues. Guardians of gates long gone, now watching over glass cases. Children press their faces to the glass, eyes wide, unknowingly gazing into their own deep past. For scholars, the Hittites are a field of study. For locals, they are something more elusive. A presence, not haunting, but constant. A reminder that their hills and rivers once carried the pulse of an empire. Some stories are told in books, others are carried in landscape. In one village, I met an old woman who pointed to a broken pillar at the edge of her field. Her father told her it had always been there. Her grandfather said the same. No one moved it. It was just part of the land. Later, I learned it was a fragment of a Hittite temple, not because she claimed it, but because the stone had not moved. That is how memory works here. Not loud, not formal, but rooted. Generations walk the same paths, drink from the same springs, rest in the shade of the same trees. And in doing so, they trace the outline of something ancient without needing to name it. The Hittites are not gone. They are sediment, layered beneath centuries of footsteps, found in broken stone, inherited silence, and forgotten fields. The echo is soft, but it is there, beneath every plow, beneath every footprint, beneath every breeze that stirs the dust across Anatolia. To walk this land is to walk through memory, not just of battles and kings, but of people, of rhythm, of resilience. And though time may blur the lines, it cannot erase the presence. The empire sleeps, but the soil still speaks. The sun was low when we made our final pass through the ruins of Hattusa. Light filtered through the broken arches, warm against the cold stone. It felt less like an ending and more like a threshold, as if the city, though silent, still waited for something, for someone to remember, for someone to ask why it had been forgotten at all. The Hittite Empire was once one of the great powers of the ancient world. It rivaled Egypt. It brokered peace with kings. It built cities into mountains and turned fire into metal. And yet, for nearly 3,000 years, it disappeared, not just from the land, but from memory. No epic poems carried its name through the centuries. No temples remained active. No living language survived to bear witness. The empire simply dissolved. Swallowed by time, scattered in fragments across the soil, even the name Hittite came later, borrowed from biblical passages and applied without full understanding. How does an empire vanish so completely? Not just physically, but spiritually? Part of it is geography. The heart of Hatti lay in highlands far from the great trade centers of later civilizations. When the empire fell, there were no nearby powers eager to preserve its legacy. The world moved on. Part of it was silence. The Hittites, for all their accomplishments, left no Rosetta Stone. Their language was lost, their rituals buried. Without the ability to read their texts, their achievements remained locked away. We had the ruins, but not the voice. But perhaps part of it was design. The Hittites never built to be eternal. Their monuments were practical, not towering. Their writing was baked into clay, not carved in stone. They did not proclaim their greatness to the heavens. They recorded it in libraries that eventually burned. And yet, their story returned, slowly, quietly. In the 20th century, scholars decoded their language. Archaeologists uncovered their cities. Mythologies once thought to be Sumerian or Hurrian revealed Hittite versions, told with different gods, different fears. What had been erased began to reemerge. It turns out the Hittites gave us more than we realized. They crafted one of the oldest peace treaties in history. They developed a legal system that combined fairness with ritual. They were among the first to work with iron. They managed an empire of diversity without forced assimilation. Their world was complex and deeply human. They taught that empire is not just territory, it is the ability to adapt, to absorb, to blend without losing identity. They worshipped 1,000 gods not because they had to, but because they understood that divinity could wear many faces. And now, as we walk their roads, read their tablets, and stand in the shadows of their temples, we begin to see the outline of what was almost lost. The shape of a people who knew how to wield silence, who ruled not just with swords, but with treaties, with rituals, with memory. The empire that time tried to erase was never truly gone. It waited, buried beneath centuries of dust and forgetfulness. It waited in clay, in stone, in the distant rhythm of old languages rising again. And in rediscovering them, we are reminded of something simple and profound. That history is not a straight line. It bends, it buries, it breaks, but it also endures. The Hittites may not have built wonders to last forever, but they built a world. And for those who listen closely, that world still speaks, quietly, patiently, through echoes in the stone, through symbols on clay, through the firelight of memory. This was the Hittite Empire, not a myth, not a mystery, but a truth, nearly lost, now found, and never forgotten again. The wind moves differently here. It circles through broken gates, hums low between fallen stones, and stirs the dust as if searching for something once spoken. We came seeking answers, to understand how the Hittite Empire rose, ruled, and then disappeared. But what we found was more than history. We found a story of resilience, of silence, of survival. The Hittites did not build for glory. They built for function, for meaning, for continuity. Their cities were not meant to dazzle, but to last. Their words were pressed into clay, not carved into mountains. And when their world fell, it did so not with spectacle, but with quiet. No last stand. No triumphant fall, just fire. And then, stillness. But in that stillness, something remained. Memory. Buried in fields, scattered in fragments, waiting for someone to listen again. That is the legacy of the Hittites. Not just as conquerors or kings, but as custodians of something more delicate. The knowledge that identity is not measured by how loud it is spoken, but by how deeply it endures. We walked through temples aligned with stars, read laws shaped by compassion and fear, followed roads carved into mountain passes, and uncovered myths that traveled farther than their armies ever could. In every fragment, a glimpse of a people who understood that to rule the world, one must first understand it. And though time tried to erase them, it failed. Because even if the empire burned, the earth held the imprint. And now, with every tablet translated, with every ruin mapped, with every gate stood before, once more we bring them back into the fold of memory. The Hittites are no longer a footnote. They are a chapter, a testament to the complexity of ancient life. A mirror held to our own fragile empires and shifting identities. Their story is not just about power, it is about loss and rediscovery, and how every civilization, no matter how deeply buried, waits to be heard again. This journey does not end here. The expedition continues. There are always more echoes in the dust, and more truths hidden beneath the stones. We walk on with the past beneath our feet,